In the final hours of April 29th, 1945, as Russian artillery illuminated the Berlin skyline and starvation gripped the fallen capital, head chef Klaus Hoffmann discovered what his kitchen staff was truly serving at Stalag The 47-year-old former restaurant owner watched in horror as Gerhard Müller, his assistant of 15 years, pulled a bloodied Wehrmacht uniform from beneath the torso he was butchering for the evening meal. The air in the cellar kitchen carried the unmistakable metallic scent of blood mixed with boiling bone marrow, while distant explosions punctuated the rhythmic sound of cleavers against wood. Outside, a crowd of starving Berlin citizens gathered, their collective murmurs rising like prayers for salvation rather than demands for rations. The sound of artillery grew closer with each passing hour, vibrating through the foundation stones of a city collapsing both physically and morally. What happened next would become the most carefully concealed atrocity of the final days of the European theater, an act so abhorrent that Allied commanders chose to bury the evidence rather than reveal it to a world already overwhelmed with horror. This is the story of how desperation transformed ordinary cooks into monsters, how American prisoners unknowingly consumed the ultimate taboo, and how one man's moral choice rippled through 3 generations of survivors. Subscribe now to discover what American intelligence buried in classified files until 1997, and why some survivors still wake screaming from nightmares they cannot explain. The kitchen at Stalag had never been intended to serve as many prisoners as it now housed. Originally designed as an administrative building for the Reich's Ministry of Transportation, the neoclassical structure on Wilhelmstrasse had been hastily converted in February of 1945, when Allied bombing made the regular prison camps untenable. Its basement level, once filled with archived railway schedules and engineering documents, now served as both kitchen and sleeping quarters for the 7 German staff, who prepared meals for 342 American prisoners of war. The stone walls, nearly 2 feet thick, muffled the constant bombardment above, creating an artificial calm that made the kitchen seem disconnected from the apocalypse consuming Berlin street by street. Klaus Hoffmann had accepted the position of head chef without enthusiasm. At 47 years old, with thinning gray hair and hands perpetually stained from decades of kitchen work, he had once owned Berlin's celebrated Zum Schwarzen Adler restaurant. The establishment had been renowned for its suckling pig and venison dishes before Allied bombing destroyed it in 1943. Since then, Klaus had survived through a series of increasingly desperate positions, each one marking his descent from respected culinary artist to glorified military cook. His wife Margaret had died in the same bombing that claimed his restaurant, leaving Klaus with nothing but his professional identity, an identity that eroded further with each degradation of his craft. The kitchen staff consisted primarily of those deemed unfit for combat. Gerhard Müller, 53, with a clubfoot that had spared him from the front lines but not from the silent contempt of fanatical party members. Twin sisters, Hanna and Helga Weber, 34, whose expertise in stretching rations had made them valuable to the Reich's dwindling food supply chain, and whose fanatical devotion to National Socialism remained undiminished even as Berlin crumbled. Otto Schmidt, 61, a butcher whose 3 sons had died at Stalingrad, and whose subsequent breakdown had transformed a once jovial craftsman into a hollow-eyed shell who spoke primarily in grunts and curses. Franz Becker, 21, missing his right hand from a factory accident that had occurred while manufacturing Panzer components in 1944, still carrying the idealism of Hitler Youth despite the Reich's obvious collapse. And Ingrid Kraus, 40, whose husband's party connections had secured her relatively safe employment while he commanded a Volkssturm unit of old men and children somewhere in the city's crumbling outskirts. Each member of the kitchen staff carried their own private war within them. Klaus observed their coping mechanisms with professional detachment. Gerhard's meticulous inventory records that provided an illusion of control, the Weber twins' rigid adherence to increasingly meaningless regulations, Otto's silent rage, Franz's desperate optimism, Ingrid's compulsive hoarding of scraps. In another context, these behaviors might have merited psychiatric intervention. In Berlin's final days, they represented entirely rational adaptations to a world disintegrating into chaos. By April of 1945, Berlin existed in a state of collective psychosis. Russian forces encircled the city. Hitler had retreated to his bunker. Food supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing. The average citizen's ration allowed approximately 650 calories per day, when it could be fulfilled at all, which was increasingly rare. Black market prices had reached absurd levels. A single loaf of bread might cost a month's wages. A pound of real coffee beans might purchase a small house, had any houses remained intact. Bodies lay in streets for days, sometimes stripped of clothing or usable items by passers-by who had moved beyond conventional morality. Children with hollow eyes carried weapons meant for adults. Elderly couples committed suicide rather than face the approaching Russians. The city smelled of smoke, sewage, and decomposition. the distinct olfactory signature of civilization's collapse. In this environment of absolute deprivation, the American prisoners at Stalag 9 experienced a peculiar reality. According to Geneva Convention requirements, which German officials still maintained for Western Allied prisoners, even as the Third Reich collapsed around them, POWs were entitled to adequate food rations. This created the perverse situation where captive American soldiers sometimes received better provisions than their German guards or the starving civilian population. The Americans, mostly airmen, shot down during bombing raids, were housed in converted office spaces throughout the administrative building. Their quarters were crowded but not inhumane, their treatment correct, if not compassionate, a final vestige of military protocol in a nation where such concepts were rapidly evaporating elsewhere. Major William Preston of the United States Army Air Forces served as the senior American officer at Stalag 9. At 34 years old, with a mathematics degree from Princeton and 2 years of combat experience, Preston maintained discipline among his fellow prisoners through a combination of formal authority and genuine concern for their welfare. His German language skills, acquired during pre-war graduate studies, made him the natural liaison with camp administrators. Each morning, he inspected the food preparation areas as permitted by camp regulations, maintaining the appearance of normality even as Berlin descended into madness beyond the facility's walls. The reality of April 1945, however, rendered such regulations increasingly meaningless. Supply lines to Berlin had been severed, food warehouses had been bombed or emptied. The only remaining sources of nutrition came from hidden caches, government reserves being frantically distributed to prevent civilian uprising, and whatever could be scavenged, stolen, or improvised. For Klaus Hoffmann, this created a daily nightmare. Each morning he received diminishing supplies with orders to feed hundreds of prisoners. His professional pride, not yet entirely extinguished by 6 years of war, demanded he provide something resembling actual meals. His German practicality insisted on stretching provisions beyond rational limits. His humanity, that increasingly quiet voice, worried about both his prisoners and fellow Berliners starving outside the kitchen walls. He found himself trapped between impossible demands and limited resources, between military requirements and human needs, between professional standards and survival necessities. The Americans themselves presented another layer of complexity. They came from every corner of the United States. Farm boys from Nebraska who had never left their counties before the war, sophisticated New Yorkers who spoke of Broadway shows and jazz clubs, Southerners with drawling accents and stories of heat that made Berlin's summer seem cool, Californians who described orange groves and movie studios with equal familiarity. Their youth struck Klaus most forcefully, many barely into their 20s, their faces still holding traces of childhood despite the hardening effects of combat and captivity. They complained about the food with the entitlement of those who had never known true hunger. Yet Klaus could not bring himself to resent them for this innocence. In another life, they might have been his restaurant patrons, not his unwilling guests. On April 27th, a Tuesday that dawned with the now familiar sound of distant artillery and the acrid smell of buildings burning somewhere to the east, Klaus stood in the kitchen supply area performing his daily inventory. The concrete floor remained perpetually damp despite repeated mopping, creating a clammy chill that penetrated through his worn leather shoes. Overhead, a single electric bulb swung slightly with each distant explosion, casting moving shadows across stacks of increasingly empty crates and shelves. We have 19 kilograms of turnips, 14 kilograms of potatoes, approximately 6 kilograms of horse meat, and 30 kilograms of bread for today, Gerhard announced after the delivery truck had departed. He referred to his meticulous inventory notebook, which had become progressively emptier as weeks passed. The pencil notations had grown smaller as he attempted to conserve paper, creating a visual representation of Berlin's contracting circumstances. Also, 800 grams of salt and some dried herbs. The driver said this might be the final delivery. Russian units have cut the southern supply route. Klaus calculated quickly, his restaurant experience making the arithmetic automatic. That's less than half what we need for minimal rations, he said, keeping his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. The implications extended beyond mathematical shortfall into territory of genuine crisis. The commandant will not accept another reduction. He was explicit yesterday. The commandant can manifest food from his asshole, then, muttered Otto, the butcher, as he sharpened his cleaver with methodical strokes that seemed almost meditative. At 61, with a face mapped by deep wrinkles and a permanent scowl, Otto had lost his capacity for diplomatic speech, along with his 3 sons at Stalingrad. There is nothing more to give. Berlin is eating itself. The kitchen staff's eyes turned toward Klaus, seeking direction in the face of impossibility. This was the burden of leadership, not merely distributing work, but providing purpose when purpose seemed absurd. He felt the weight of their collective gaze, remembering similar moments in his restaurant when unexpected crises arose. Then, solutions had always existed. Suppliers could be called, menu items substituted, customers placated with complimentary wine. Now, no such options remained. We have the emergency stores, suggested Franz, the youngest staff member, breaking the tense silence. His empty right sleeve was pinned neatly to his shoulder, while his remaining hand fidgeted nervously with his collar. The constant movement betrayed anxiety that his youthful enthusiasm couldn't fully mask. The dried goods in the western storage room, the commandant's private reserve, if we access just a portion, those are reserved for German personnel only, by direct order. Hannah Weber interrupted sharply, her thin face tightening with disapproval. The severe center part in her blonde hair emphasized her angular features, creating an impression of sculptured rigidity. Of all the kitchen staff, the Weber twins maintained the most fervent commitment to regulations, hierarchy, and the increasingly obvious fiction that Germany might still somehow prevail. Diverting official supplies to prisoners constitutes sabotage. The penalty remains death. The war will be over before those supplies matter, Ingrid said quietly, voicing what everyone thought but rarely stated aloud. Her hands, red and chapped from constant exposure to water and harsh soap, twisted her apron nervously. Dark circles beneath her eyes testified to nights spent listening for air raid sirens, wondering if her husband still lived. The Russians are less than 10 kilometers away. We all heard the radio before they cut transmission. What difference will regulations make when the Soviets arrive? The unspoken question hung in the air. What awaited them all when Berlin finally fell? Stories from the eastern territories had circulated for months, whispered accounts of retribution, mass rapes, executions. The Americans or British would be preferable captors. Most Berliners agreed, but the Russians would reach them first. It was simply geography. Later that afternoon, Major William Preston arrived at the kitchen for his daily inspection. The American officer's once crisp uniform had grown threadbare during his 8 months of captivity, but he maintained military bearing with resolute dignity. His lean frame had grown leaner, cheekbones more prominent beneath intelligent blue eyes that missed nothing. Herr Hoffmann, he greeted Klaus in serviceable German, I must formally protest the continued reduction in rations. My men are already 20% below Geneva Convention standards according to our calculations. Klaus gestured toward the nearly empty storage area. As you can see, Major, I cannot create food from nothing. Berlin itself is starving. Preston surveyed the sparse supplies with a carefully neutral expression. My men report of civilians gathered outside the facility. They appear to be waiting for something. Food distribution, perhaps? They wait because there is nowhere else to go, Klaus answered, the half-truth coming easily after years of wartime ambiguity. The civilian food distribution center 2 blocks east was destroyed in Tuesday's bombing. The American studied Klaus's face, clearly detecting the evasion, but choosing not to press. We've been hearing rumors, he said, lowering his voice, although no one else was within earshot. The German guards talk. They say Hitler has gone mad in his bunker, that Speer is disobeying destruction orders, that some SS units are executing anyone suggesting surrender. Klaus remained silent. Such conversations were dangerous, despite Berlin's obvious collapse. Defeatist statements remained technically punishable by summary execution. The fact that enforcement had become sporadic made it no less risky to acknowledge reality to a prisoner. Preston seemed to understand the imposed silence. My men need protein, Herr Hoffmann. They're growing weak. Illness is spreading. Whatever you can provide, even if it's not what we're accustomed to, would help. I will do what I can, Major, Klaus said finally. But you should prepare your men for further reductions. The situation everywhere is. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Beyond normal parameters. Preston nodded grimly. War has a way of redefining normal, doesn't it? He glanced toward the butcher's station where Otto worked with mechanical precision. That meat? Horse, I assume? Yes, Klaus answered too quickly. Cavalry mounts, no longer needed. Something flickered in Preston's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or simple recognition of how thoroughly war had degraded everyone's expectations. He extended his hand, an unexpectedly humane gesture that momentarily breached the divide between captor and captive. Good luck, Chef Hoffmann. I think we'll all need it in the coming days. Klaus shook the offered hand, momentarily startled by the simple human connection it represented. And to you, Major Preston. After the American departed, Klaus stood motionless, considering what he had not said, that the horse meat had arrived without documentation, that Otto's explanations about its source grew vaguer each delivery, that the kitchen staff had silently agreed not to examine too closely what sustained them all as Berlin died around them. What they could do, however, proved increasingly creative as April advanced. The Weber twins developed recipes that stretched food beyond all reasonable proportions. Bread bulked with sawdust, soups thickened with boiled wallpaper paste, the adhesive contained potato starch, sausages filled with whatever material might pass for meat when ground finely enough. They boiled leather belts and boots to extract any remaining nutrients, converted furniture polish into cooking oil, fermented cabbage leaves salvaged from garbage. The results rarely tasted good, but they filled stomachs and provided minimal calories. Otto's butchery skills transformed questionable ingredients into passable meals. His ability to extract every usable portion from increasingly dubious meat sources became legendary among the staff. His knife work remained impeccable despite the deteriorating quality of his materials, his movements economical and precise, preserving every edible scrap. In the 19th century, Parisians ate rats during the Prussian siege, he remarked once while transforming a collection of alley cats into something resembling rabbit. Hunger is the best seasoning. Ingrid developed methods for disguising flavors that might otherwise make their concoctions unpalatable. She cultivated window boxes of herbs, thyme, rosemary, wild garlic, that helped mask the increasingly questionable taste of their protein sources. She collected cigarette butts from German guards, drying the remaining tobacco to use as a flavor enhancer and appetite suppressant in certain dishes. Her intuitive understanding of how to fool the palate proved invaluable as their ingredients deteriorated. Gerhard maintained meticulous records of every substitution and adaptation, creating a strange archive of culinary desperation that he referred to as wartime innovations. He seemed to believe these recipes might have value in Germany's future, a touching optimism that assumed there would be a future worth documenting. His notebook contained increasingly desperate entries: stretching agent for ground meat, soaked newspaper with bone meal, ratio 1:3, or bread extender, sawdust, clay, and floor sweepings, maximum 40% by volume. Franz, with his single hand, became adept at rehydrating dried foods and extending their volume through careful timing. He discovered that certain items absorbed more water if soaked precisely 12 hours rather than the standard overnight, increasing their yield by up to 15%. His engineering background, cut short by his factory accident, found unexpected application in the mechanics of food preservation and preparation. Klaus coordinated these efforts with the detached efficiency of a man operating on automatic systems, while his higher functions processed grief. His restaurant training had prepared him for crisis management, but nothing had equipped him for overseeing what increasingly resembled a laboratory for human sustenance rather than an actual kitchen. He found himself thinking of his dead wife at unexpected moments, wondering what Margaret would make of what he had become, of the moral compromises he navigated daily. Klaus never directly asked about the origin of certain meats that appeared in his kitchen during those final weeks. Berlin contained thousands of horses, dogs, zoo animals, rats, pigeons. All potential food sources as conventional supplies vanished. The city zoo had been bombed repeatedly, releasing exotic animals that occasionally provided unexpected protein sources. A camel had reportedly been butchered in the Tiergarten district in March. Rumors circulated about the last elephant being consumed by an SS officer's mess. The moral distinction between eating a horse and eating a zebra seemed increasingly academic as starvation intensified. When Otto occasionally arrived with parcels wrapped in newspaper, expressing vague explanations about arrangements and connections, Klaus focused on the technical challenges of preparation rather than provenance. He told himself this selective blindness represented appropriate delegation rather than deliberate avoidance. Otto handled procurement and initial processing. Klaus managed final preparation. This division of responsibility had served restaurants for centuries. That it now potentially concealed something more sinister than merely unorthodox ingredients remained unacknowledged. The American prisoners accepted the increasingly strange meals with varying degrees of complaint. Some, particularly those from rural backgrounds accustomed to hunting and processing their own meat, seemed to recognize the unlikely nature of certain dishes, but ate without comment. Others, predominantly from urban areas, complained vocally about taste and texture, but consumed their rations regardless. A few refused certain meals entirely, preferring hunger to what they perceived as contaminated food. "The meat tastes wrong," a young gunner from Philadelphia told Major Preston during an inspection. "Ain't like any animal I ever ate back home." "It's probably horse," Preston had replied, repeating Klaus's explanation. "Europeans eat horse commonly, or perhaps dog. I've heard that's becoming common as the city runs out of livestock." "No, sir," the gunner insisted. "My grandpappy raised horses. This ain't horse, it's something else." Preston reported such concerns to Klaus, who provided increasingly elaborate explanations about emergency preservation methods, strange local breeds, and chemical changes from inadequate refrigeration. The American officer accepted these justifications with visible skepticism, but limited options. His responsibility to maintain morale among his men made pursuing unpleasant theories counterproductive without definitive evidence. This studied ignorance shattered on April 29, 1945. The day began with distant artillery fire, Russian guns announcing their position on Berlin's outskirts. The concussive thumps had drawn closer each day, a deadly metronome counting down the city's remaining hours. The kitchen staff arrived before dawn, moving through darkened streets under curfew, navigating rubble piles and craters where roads had once existed. The eastern sky glowed orange from burning buildings, casting an apocalyptic light across Berlin's shattered profile. The air carried the acrid smell of cordite, burning rubber, and the distinctive sweet putrid odor of decomposing bodies, some buried under collapsed buildings, others lying exposed where they had fallen. Klaus arrived first, unlocking the heavy basement door with hands that had grown increasingly unsteady in recent days. Sleep deprivation, inadequate nutrition, and the constant stress of managing impossible expectations had taken physical toll. His uniform hung loosely on his frame. His once precise movements had become uncertain. The face that greeted him in broken mirror fragments showed a stranger, hollow-cheeked, gray-skinned, with eyes that had retreated into darkened sockets. They worked by lamplight, conserving the unreliable electricity for essential cooking tasks. The basement kitchen, with its low ceiling and small windows near the top of the walls, felt increasingly like a tomb. Water dripped steadily from one corner where Allied bombing had damaged pipes in the floors above. The sound created a constant background rhythm that occasionally accelerated with distant explosions, as though the building itself were weeping in time with the city's destruction. Klaus was preparing bread dough, measuring precious flour with the precision of a pharmacist, when Otto arrived 2 hours late, accompanied by Gerhard. Both men appeared haggard, with smudges of soot across their faces and clothing. Between them they carried a heavy object wrapped in sacking, which they brought directly to the butchering station in the kitchen's far corner. "Special delivery," Otto announced with grim satisfaction. "Enough proper meat for 2 days if we manage it carefully." "What is it?" Klaus asked, wiping flour from his hands. "And where did you get meat in quantity with the city surrounded?" "Better you don't ask questions, chef," Otto replied, using Klaus's former professional title, a small courtesy that had survived the war's indignities. "Just know we won't be serving slop today." Something in Otto's tone triggered Klaus's suspicion. In normal times, he would have demanded a proper answer. His kitchen, his responsibility. But these were not normal times, and part of him recognized the wisdom in Otto's suggestion. Knowledge carried responsibility, ignorance offered protection, however temporary. The morning proceeded with renewed energy. The prospect of serving actual meat lifted the staff's spirits. Klaus assigned routine tasks, then focused on creating a stew that might remind prisoners of proper food. Onions, saved from previous days, hoarded spices, carefully cubed meat that Otto prepared with uncharacteristic silence. By midday, the kitchen filled with the forgotten aroma of real cooking. For a moment, they might have been in any busy kitchen in any normal time, rather than the dying spasms of the Third Reich. Even the Weber twins smiled as they stirred enormous pots. The illusion shattered when Klaus noticed Gerhard behaving strangely at the butchering station. His assistant kept glancing toward the storage room, then back to Otto's work area, his expression troubled. And when Otto stepped away to retrieve more salt, Gerhard quickly moved to the remaining wrapped portions of meat and partially lifted the sacking. Klaus observed this from across the kitchen, noting the sudden rigidity in Gerhard's posture. Setting down his ladle, Klaus crossed the room. "What's the matter?" he asked quietly. Gerhard startled, nearly dropping the wrapping. "Nothing, chef. Just checking what cuts remain for tomorrow." But his eyes told a different story, wide with something beyond surprise or concern, something closer to horror. Klaus waited until the noon meal had been served, watching as Gerhard and Otto exchanged glances throughout the morning. When the prisoners' food had been distributed and the kitchen staff broke for their own meager lunch, Klaus approached the butchering station under the pretext of cleaning. What he discovered changed everything. Beneath the remaining sacking lay not an animal carcass, but unmistakably human remains. A partial torso, methodically sectioned as Otto would prepare any large mammal. And beneath the flesh, barely visible but unmistakable, scraps of Wehrmacht uniform fabric, including a portion of insignia. Klaus stepped back, bile rising in his throat. The room seemed to tilt around him as comprehension locked into place. The mysterious meat deliveries of recent weeks, Otto's vague explanations, the surprising quality of certain meals despite Berlin's starvation. They had been feeding the prisoners dead German soldiers. Whether these were battlefield casualties, executed deserters, or victims of opportunistic murder, Klaus couldn't determine from what remained. The how and why suddenly seemed secondary to the inescapable reality before him. He turned to find Gerhard standing in the doorway, face ashen. "You've seen it then," Gerhard said, not a question. "How long?" Klaus asked, his voice barely audible. 3 weeks, maybe 4. It started with actual casualties. Soldiers who couldn't be properly buried because of the bombing. Otto has a cousin in the emergency services. Then, Gerhard trailed off, swallowing hard. Then I think they became less particular about the source. The others know? Otto and the twins, certainly. Possibly Ingrid. Franz suspects but doesn't want confirmation. Klaus leaned against the butcher block, suddenly needing support. "We've been feeding human flesh to prisoners of war," he stated flatly, needing to hear the words aloud as if speaking might somehow make the incomprehensible real. We've been feeding human flesh to everyone, Klaus, Gerhardt corrected gently, including ourselves. The horror of this revelation struck Klaus with physical force. He recalled meals he had personally consumed, praised even in recent weeks, how Otto had seemed pleased by his compliments on a particularly successful venison stew. The thought triggered immediate nausea, and he barely made it to a waste bucket before vomiting. When he had emptied his stomach, Klaus found Gerhard offering a rag to wipe his mouth. "What do we do now?" his assistant asked. It was the question that would define the remaining days of the war for Klaus Hoffmann, and the decades that followed. What does one do upon discovering they have become, however unwittingly, complicit in an atrocity? That they have crossed a line so profound that return to normal life becomes unimaginable? "We stop it," Klaus said finally. "Immediately." "And then what? Report Otto? To whom?" "Berlin has no functioning authority except desperate men with guns. The Americans will execute us all if they learn what we've done." "Not if we can prove we stopped it once we knew." Gerhard laughed bitterly. "Prove? To victors? We are Germans in 1945, Klaus. Our guilt was established the moment we were born German." Before Klaus could respond, the kitchen door opened, and Otto entered with Franz. They stopped abruptly, registering the tension, Gerhard's protective stance, Klaus's proximity to the exposed remains. "Ah," Otto said after a moment. "Now we all know." What followed was perhaps the strangest staff meeting in culinary history. 5 of the 7 kitchen workers gathered in the storage room: Klaus, Gerhard, Otto, Franz, and Ingrid. The Weber twins continued preparing the evening meal, either genuinely ignorant or maintaining plausible deniability. Otto spoke with the detached practicality of a man who had moved beyond conventional morality. "We have 342 prisoners plus guards to feed. Berlin has no food. These men," he gestured vaguely toward the butchering area, "are already dead. They no longer need their flesh. The living do." "This is cannibalism," Klaus stated, still struggling to process the reality. "This is survival," Otto countered. "My 3 sons died at Stalingrad. You know what happened there at the end? The surrounded German forces ate their dead comrades. The Russians ate their own dead too, not because they were monsters, but because they were men who wanted to live. The prisoners don't know what they're eating," Ingrid added softly. "Perhaps that's a mercy." "A mercy?" Franz interjected, his young face contorted with disgust. "We're violating everything. Human decency, international law, basic morality." "International law?" Otto repeated mockingly. "Tell me, boy, what does international law say about firebombing Dresden? About what the Russians are doing to German women as they advance? The world ended already. We just haven't accepted it yet." Klaus raised his hand, silencing the brewing argument. "Regardless of how we reach this point, we have a choice about what happens next." He turned to Otto. "No more human meat. Whatever we have now is the last of it. We'll manage with what legitimate supplies remain." "And when there's nothing left at all?" Otto challenged. "Then we serve nothing and face the consequences." Otto studied him carefully. "You would rather these Americans, these men who have been bombing our cities for years, who have killed German women and children, you would rather they starve than eat what will otherwise rot?" "I would rather retain some fragment of our humanity," Klaus answered. "However foolish that seems to you." A heavy silence filled the small storeroom. Finally, Otto shrugged. "As you wish, chef. It's your kitchen. But remember this conversation when you're explaining to hungry prisoners why their rations have disappeared completely." The decision made, they returned to work with the surreal knowledge hanging between them. The afternoon passed in tense silence. Klaus instructed the Weber twins to dispose of the remaining meat from Otto's delivery and rely solely on their dwindling legitimate supplies. They complied without question, though Hannah's narrowed eyes suggested she understood more than she acknowledged. That evening, as prisoners received their meager portions of turnip soup and sawdust-extended bread, Klaus watched their faces, Americans mostly in their 20s, thin from captivity but still healthier than the average Berliner. Did they suspect what they had been eating these past weeks? Some glanced at their bowls with suspicion, but hunger overcame hesitation. Klaus wondered if he would ever view the act of eating without remembering this moment. After the kitchen closed for the night, Klaus remained behind, ostensibly to complete inventory, but actually to search Otto's domain more thoroughly. In a locked cabinet, he discovered a notebook containing detailed records, dates, locations, descriptions of acquisitions. The methodical documentation chilled him more than the act itself. It suggested not desperate improvisation, but calculated system. Most entries described German military casualties obtained through Otto's cousin, but later pages included more disturbing notations. Male, civilian, approximately 45 years old, found near Alexanderplatz bunker. Two females, approximately 20 and 50, discovered in bombed apartment building. The most recent entry, dated April 28th, simply read, "Former party official. Executed by SS for defeatism, obtained through K connection." Klaus sat heavily on a kitchen stool, the notebook open before him. The evidence was irrefutable. Otto's and unknown collaborators had moved beyond opportunistic use of war casualties to deliberate harvesting of the dead, and possibly even murder. The systematic nature suggested organization beyond their small kitchen. Perhaps other facilities, serving other prisoner camps, or even the civilian population, were engaged in similar practices. The question of what to do with this knowledge consumed him through the sleepless night. By morning, Klaus had reached a decision. He could not undo what had already occurred, but he could document it. Future justice would require evidence. Over the next 2 days, as Russian forces drew steadily closer and the Third Reich collapsed into final chaos, Klaus Hoffmann did 3 significant things. First, he created his own detailed record, naming everyone involved, describing the operation, and acknowledging his own unwitting participation and subsequent discovery. He wrote this confession in duplicate, sealing one copy inside a metal box, which he concealed within the kitchen wall behind loose bricks. Second, he collected samples from the remaining human remains, preserving them in spirits inside labeled specimen jars, which he hid alongside his written testimony. If accusations ever emerged later, evidence would exist to support them. Third, he began systematically poisoning Otto Schmidt. The decision to kill Otto came neither easily nor from passion. Klaus considered it with the same practical evaluation he might give to removing a dangerously spoiled ingredient from his kitchen. Otto represented ongoing threat to prisoners, to fellow Berliners, to whatever fragile humanity might survive the war. Klaus had seen the man's notebook. The entries would not stop voluntarily. Digitalis from foxglove plants growing in the administrative building's damaged garden provided the means. Klaus had rudimentary knowledge of herbs and their properties from his culinary training. He knew digitalis could cause heart failure that might appear natural, particularly in an older man during stressful circumstances. He added increasing doses to Otto's personal food over 3 days. On May 2nd, 1945, as Russian forces fought their way through Berlin's central districts, Otto Schmidt collapsed while preparing the morning meal. He died before medical assistance could be summoned, though in the chaos of Berlin's fall, such assistance likely wouldn't have arrived anyway. No one questioned the death of a 61-year-old man in such circumstances. Klaus arranged for the body to be removed by the increasingly overwhelmed civil authorities, who had no capacity for autopsies or investigations. Otto was simply another casualty in a city defined by death. That same day, the American prisoners at Stalag learned of Hitler's suicide. Their guards, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, began deserting their posts. By evening, the prison existed in name only. The Americans remained inside primarily for safety from the chaotic street fighting rather than from any continued enforcement. On May 3rd, 1945, the first Russian soldiers reached the facility. The transition occurred with surprising order, considering the circumstances. Soviet officers registered the Americans for eventual repatriation while establishing temporary command. The Americans were now technically free, but advised to remain until safe transportation could be arranged. Throughout this transition, Klaus and his remaining staff continued providing what food they could, though supplies had dwindled to virtually nothing. The Russians brought some military rations, which were distributed among both prisoners and kitchen workers. For the first time in weeks, Klaus ate food he knew with certainty contained no human flesh. The reckoning came 2 days later when an American intelligence officer named Captain James Miller arrived with specific orders to investigate Stalag 9. Unlike the frontline Russian troops, Captain Miller brought detailed objectives and the methodical approach of someone building a legal case rather than fighting a war. He began interviewing staff and prisoners, examining records, photographing facilities. His German language skills, while accented, proved surprisingly fluent. Klaus observed the officer's systematic approach with growing apprehension. It seemed inevitable that the truth would emerge. On May 8th, the day Germany surrendered unconditionally, Captain Miller summoned Klaus to the former commandant's office. "Herr Hoffmann," Miller began, consulting his notes, "you've been head of kitchen operations here since February, correct?" "Yes, sir," Klaus confirmed, standing awkwardly before the desk where Miller had established his temporary headquarters. "I've heard interesting things about your facility," Miller continued. "Several prisoners report receiving meat in their meals until quite recently, despite Berlin's severe shortages. Can you explain how that was possible?" The moment had arrived. The question that would determine whatever remained of Klaus Hoffmann's life. He could lie. He could claim ignorance. He could implicate others while minimizing his own knowledge. Many Germans were already adopting such strategies as occupation solidified. Instead, Klaus reached slowly into his jacket and removed a folded document, the duplicate of his hidden testimony. Captain Miller, I believe this will address your questions more comprehensively than any verbal explanation I might offer. Miller accepted the papers with a raised eyebrow, then began reading. His expression remained professionally neutral, though Klaus detected subtle changes, a tightening around the eyes, a momentary pause in breathing, a slight pallor beneath his tanned skin. When Miller finished reading, he placed the document carefully on the desk between them. For nearly a minute he said nothing, simply studying Klaus with an unreadable expression. You understand this constitutes evidence of war crimes, he finally said. Crimes in which you acknowledge participation, regardless of your claimed ignorance until April 29th. I understand. You've included information about physical evidence hidden in the kitchen, specimens, confirming documentation. Yes. Behind the third brick from the floor, fifth row from the corner near the dry storage room, the metal box contains everything necessary to verify my account. Miller leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Why provide this voluntarily, Herr Hoffman? You might have simply claimed all meat came from horses or dogs. We lack resources for thorough forensic investigation given current conditions. Klaus considered the question carefully before answering. Because truth matters, Captain Miller. Even, perhaps especially, when it's terrible. What happened in that kitchen was an atrocity. Regardless of circumstances or rationales, people have a right to know what was done to them. Even if that knowledge destroys them? Some truths are too important to remain hidden no matter the consequences. Miller stood abruptly, moving to the window overlooking the ruined Berlin cityscape. That's where I disagree with you, Herr Hoffman. Some truths serve no purpose except to compound suffering. He turned back to face Klaus. Consider the practical implications. If this becomes public, what happens? 300 American servicemen learned they were fed human flesh, possibly for weeks. The psychological trauma alone would be devastating. Many would never recover mentally. The political implications would be equally severe. Demands for mass executions, potentially including kitchen staff who knew nothing. International headlines that would inflame already volatile conditions as occupation begins. Justice requires... Klaus began. Justice? Miller interrupted sharply. What justice exists in this city right now? The Russians are conducting mass rapes a kilometer from where we stand. Revenge killings occur hourly. Denazification will require impossible moral distinctions and compromises for years to come. In this environment, what does justice for cannibalized corpses look like exactly? Klaus had no immediate answer. Miller continued, his voice softening slightly. I'm not dismissing the significance of what occurred here. It was monstrous. But I'm questioning whether exposing it serves any constructive purpose whatsoever. He lifted Klaus's written testimony. I believe your account. I'll verify the physical evidence you've indicated. I'll document everything thoroughly. But I'm recommending this entire matter be classified at the highest level. No prisoners will be informed. No kitchen staff will be prosecuted based solely on these specific actions. You would conceal this? Klaus asked incredulously. I would prevent additional needless suffering, Miller corrected. Those who died are beyond our help. The living deserve consideration. And Otto Schmidt, the others who knowingly participated? Schmidt is already dead by your own hand. As for the others, Miller gestured toward the window, they must live in this broken city under occupation. That seems punishment enough for those who acted from desperation rather than malice. Klaus felt simultaneously relieved and disturbed. The pragmatism made logical sense while violating his belief that acknowledgement was necessary for whatever healing might eventually occur. What happens to me? He finally asked. Miller considered him thoughtfully. You stopped the practice once you discovered it. You documented everything. You've cooperated fully. Those actions matter. He paused. I'm processing paperwork for former infrastructure personnel with specialized skills. You're now classified as a master baker rather than kitchen supervisor. You'll be permitted civilian status under occupation. The unexpected reprieve left Klaus momentarily speechless. One condition, Miller added. This conversation never happened. The evidence will be collected, documented, and secured. You will never speak of these events to anyone, not fellow staff, not future historians, not family if you have any, not in 1 year, not in 50 years. The matter is permanently closed. 2 weeks later, as American prisoners were transported from Berlin to processing centers for eventual repatriation, Klaus Hoffmann received civilian identification papers and permission to relocate to Munich, where distant relatives had survived the war. Captain Miller personally oversaw the retrieval of evidence from the kitchen wall, placing specimens and documentation into a secured military container. Before departing Berlin, Klaus visited the rubble of his former restaurant one final time. Nothing remained except partial foundation walls and a blackened kitchen range, improbably intact amid destruction. He stood silently among the ruins, contemplating what had been lost, not just his business or Berlin's buildings, but moral certainties the belief that civilized behavior remained innate even under pressure. He had entered the war as a respected chef, become a reluctant military cook, served unwittingly as an accessory to cannibalism, deliberately poisoned a colleague, then been granted unexpected absolution by an American intelligence officer who valued pragmatism above abstract justice. Who was he now? What did such a journey make of a person? As promised, Klaus never spoke of the events at Stalagnoi. He established a small bakery in Munich that eventually prospered during Germany's economic recovery. He married in 1952, fathered 3 children, and lived what neighbors would describe as a quiet, productive life. He died of natural causes in 1983, carrying his secrets to the grave. Captain James Miller's classified report on Stalag 9 was stored in secured American intelligence archives, accessible only to personnel with the highest clearances. It remained untouched until 1997, when Mandatory Declassification Review exposed its contents to a small group of military historians. The revelation created brief, contained controversy when declassified in 1997. Most survivors of Stalag 9 had died by then. The few remaining expressed mixed reactions, some grateful for 50 years of ignorance, others furious at the concealment. German authorities conducted a perfunctory investigation but found insufficient evidence for prosecution of any living participants. The Weber twins had died in the 1970s. Gerhard Miller had emigrated to Argentina in 1953 and disappeared from official records. Ingrid Krause had been killed during the Russian occupation in 1946. Franz Becker, the youngest kitchen worker, had apparently committed suicide in 1949. Sergeant Joseph Doherty, one of the few surviving American prisoners from Stalag 9, spoke to the Washington Post after reviewing the declassified files. "I always knew something wasn't right with that place. The food made us sick in ways that didn't make sense for simple malnutrition. Some guys couldn't keep it down but were too hungry not to try. We had this joke, Mystery Meat Mondays, but there was nothing funny about it. Finding out now, at 82 years old, what they fed us, it explains a lot, but what am I supposed to do with this information? How do you process learning you were made into an unwitting cannibal? That the nightmares you've had for 50 years had a real basis? I almost wish they'd kept it classified until after we were all dead." Medical researchers at Johns Hopkins University requested permission to examine surviving Stalag prisoners to study potential long-term effects of involuntary cannibalism, but veterans organizations successfully blocked the proposal as re-traumatizing survivors for academic curiosity. The ethical debate surrounding the government's 50-year concealment became a minor case study in military intelligence ethics courses, with competing arguments about whether truth or mercy should prevail when information offered no practical benefit but significant potential harm. The story briefly appeared in historical journals and specialized World War II publications before fading into the vast catalog of wartime atrocities, notable primarily for its grotesque nature rather than its scale or significance. No best-selling books emerged, no Hollywood films dramatized the events. The truth, once so desperately concealed, then finally revealed, proved less consequential than either Miller or Hoffman had anticipated. Perhaps the most enduring legacy appeared in unexpected form. In 2012, Klaus Hoffmann's granddaughter Elise Weber, no relation to the twins, published a novel titled The Chef's Silence. While marketed as fiction, the book contained unmistakable elements of her grandfather's experience: a Berlin kitchen during the fall, moral compromises, terrible secrets. When interviewed about her research sources, Elise mentioned finding a hidden journal after her grandmother's death, though she declined to share the original document with historians. "Some truths belong to families rather than archives," she told the Süddeutsche Zeitung. "My grandfather believed silence was sometimes mercy. I believe speaking can be an act of healing. Both perspectives deserve consideration." The novel received modest critical acclaim and moderate commercial success. It raised uncomfortable questions about survival ethics, moral compromise, and the possibility of redemption after participation in atrocity. It never claimed historical accuracy, yet readers familiar with the classified Stalag 9 reports recognized unmistakable parallels. Most powerfully, the book explored the psychological aftermath for both perpetrators and victims of food-related atrocities. It detailed how the body might retain traumatic memory even when the conscious mind remained unaware, how ingested horror might manifest as unexplained illness, psychological disturbance, or relationship dysfunction decades later. These fictional accounts closely mirrored the documented but unpublished medical histories of actual Stalag 9 survivors, suggesting Elise Weber had accessed information beyond her grandfather's journal. In a particularly haunting chapter, she described an American former POW experiencing panic attacks whenever he smelled cooking meat, though he couldn't explain why. His German-born wife, trying to help, consulted a therapist who specialized in food-related trauma. "The body remembers what the mind cannot bear to know," the fictional therapist explained. when we consume something profoundly forbidden, something that violates the most fundamental human taboo. That violation imprints on cellular memory. The conscious mind may reject the knowledge, but the body retains it. Your husband's body is trying to protect him from a truth his mind has mercifully forgotten. In the novel's most powerful scene, the protagonist, a chef who discovers colleagues serving human flesh, confronts a younger kitchen worker considering suicide over his unwitting participation. The measure of a person is not whether they remain untouched by darkness, the fictional chef tells the young man, but what they do once they recognize the darkness within themselves. Do they deny it, embrace it, or acknowledge it while fighting to reclaim whatever light remains possible? Only the third path offers any hope of becoming human again. The passage resonated deeply with survivors of various traumas, extending beyond the specific historical context to address universal questions about moral injury and recovery. Veterans groups, abuse survivors, and disaster witnesses reported finding unexpected comfort in the novel's unflinching examination of how humans rebuild identity after participating in or witnessing the unthinkable. Dr. Michelle Levinson, a trauma specialist at Columbia University who worked with survivors of the September 11th attacks, incorporated the novel into her therapeutic approach. What Weber captured so brilliantly is how atrocity ripples through generations, not just through direct testimony, but through embodied memory, through family systems, through unexplained behaviors that only make sense when we understand their origins. Her grandfather's experience as both witness and participant created a dual perspective that helps contemporary readers understand that moral purity is a luxury rarely available in extremity. Whether Klaus Hoffmann actually spoke such words to Franz Becker in May of 1945 remains unconfirmed. The historical record shows only that Franz took his own life 4 years after the war, while Klaus chose to live with his knowledge for nearly 4 decades more. Franz left no suicide note, but his sister later reported his increasing obsession with food purity in his final months, refusing to eat anything he hadn't personally prepared, becoming physically ill when served meat dishes in restaurants, expressing paranoid beliefs about food contamination that doctors diagnosed as war-related psychosis. What this suggests about the relative weight of silence versus confession, and of pragmatic concealment versus cathartic disclosure, remains for each reader to consider. The Berlin Kitchen stands as testament to how quickly civilization's veneer can dissolve under sufficient pressure, and how complex the path back from such dissolution proves to be. The American prisoners who unknowingly consumed human flesh at Stalag 9 returned home, built careers, raised families, and eventually passed away, mostly unaware of what had transpired during those desperate final weeks of the European conflict. Their medical records, sealed under national security protocols until 2015, revealed disturbing patterns: significantly higher rates of gastrointestinal disorders, unexplained food aversions, stress-related eating disorders, and nightmares compared to POWs from other German facilities. Many reported persistent digestive problems that defied conventional medical explanation. Several developed obsessive rituals around food preparation. A disproportionate number struggled with alcoholism and substance abuse, possibly self-medicating for symptoms they couldn't articulate. Major William Preston, the senior American officer at Stalag 9, suffered particularly severe post-war psychological effects. His service record indicates exemplary performance until 1952, when he was hospitalized following what military physicians described as acute psychotic episode with persecutory delusions centered on food contamination. He reported believing his meals contained human remains, though he could not explain the origin of this conviction. After 3 months of treatment, he was discharged from military service with a medical pension. He died in 1971 from complications of alcoholism, never knowing how closely his delusions mirrored reality. Whether Captain Miller's decision to shield them from knowledge represented compassionate protection or paternalistic denial of autonomy similarly remains open for debate. Modern trauma specialists remain divided on whether knowing terrible truths offers better healing potential than protective ignorance. Dr. Rachel Steinman, writing in the Journal of Military Psychology in 2019, argued, "The Stalag 9 case presents a profound ethical conundrum. These men experienced physical and psychological symptoms for decades without understanding their cause. Knowledge might have contextualized their suffering, but added moral injury that perhaps exceeds the benefits of explanation. The body remembered what the mind was protected from knowing, an incomplete healing that likely preserved their ability to function in post-war society despite its costs. What remains as certain is that hunger, physical, moral, spiritual, drives humans to previously unimaginable actions. Berlin, in April 1945, created conditions where ordinary individuals made extraordinary choices, for good and ill alike. The kitchen at Stalag 9 simply concentrated these forces into particularly stark form, creating a microcosm where the broader collapse of social norms, ethical boundaries, and human dignity became visible through the most fundamental human activity: eating. The implications extend beyond historical curiosity into contemporary relevance. As climate change threatens food security, as political instability creates new refugee crises, as resource scarcity increasingly shapes global politics, the question of what humans might do when sufficiently desperate remains pertinent. The comfortable certainty that civilized behavior represents some innate human quality rather than a luxury afforded by abundance deserves skeptical examination in light of historical evidence to the contrary. Otto Schmidt's brutal pragmatism, "The dead no longer need their flesh, the living do," represents not merely the reasoning of a war-traumatized butcher, but the fundamental calculus that emerges when survival itself becomes uncertain. That this calculation can emerge in ordinary individuals, not merely monsters or sociopaths, should give pause to those who believe their own moral foundations unshakable. Equally important is Klaus Hoffmann's eventual response, the recognition that survival without humanity represents no victory worth claiming. His decision to document rather than conceal, to preserve evidence rather than destroy it, to bear witness rather than embrace denial, offers a counterpoint to Otto's nihilistic pragmatism. Both men sought survival, but Klaus refused to separate physical continuation from moral personhood, insisting that how one survives matters as much as whether one survives. As Elise Weber wrote in her novel's epilogue, history's darkest moments reveal not just human capacity for atrocity, but also for bearing witness, for choosing differently when alternatives emerge, and for carrying forward both terrible knowledge and the determination that such knowledge should serve future generations rather than merely haunting them. When the last classified documents concerning Stalag-Noint were released in 2017, they included a final note from Captain Miller, apparently added to the file shortly before his death in 1989. I remain convinced that concealing the Stalag-Noint incident was correct for its time. The immediate post-war environment contained sufficient trauma without adding this psychological burden to recovering veterans. However, history eventually requires full accounting, however uncomfortable. Future generations deserve unvarnished truth about what human beings become capable of under extreme conditions, not to condemn their ancestors, but to recognize how vigilantly they must guard their own humanity when similar pressures emerge. May those who judge us remember that morality looks different from inside the collapsing building than from the safety of historical distance. Miller's career after the war suggested his experience at Stalag-9 profoundly influenced his professional trajectory. He specialized in ethical oversight within military intelligence, advocating for clearer guidelines around information classification based on humanitarian rather than merely strategic concerns. Colleagues described him as unusually reflective for a career intelligence officer, frequently raising philosophical questions about government obligations regarding traumatic information. When presented with the Pentagon Papers controversy in 1971, he reportedly told subordinates, "There's a distinction between concealing information to protect institutions and concealing information to protect individuals. We must never conflate the two." The kitchen at Stalag-9 no longer exists. The building was demolished in 1967 to make way for commercial development in reunified Berlin. No plaque marks the location. No memorial acknowledges the uniquely macabre events that transpired in its basement during those final desperate days of the Third Reich. A luxury hotel now occupies the site, its basement converted to a spa featuring Finnish saunas and massage therapy rooms. Guests sip champagne where Otto Schmidt once processed human remains, entirely unaware of the space's grotesque history. Perhaps that absence itself forms the most fitting testament to how societies process their most disturbing chapters, sometimes through deliberate examination, sometimes through strategic forgetting, but always incompletely. The past remains simultaneously buried and present, like evidence hidden behind kitchen walls, concealed but never truly gone, waiting for future generations to decide whether excavation serves healing or merely reopens wounds that time had mercifully scabbed over. In 2021, a reunion of surviving family members from Stalag-Noint POWs took place in Washington, D.C. Organized by Robert Doherty, grandson of Sergeant Joseph Doherty, the gathering brought together approximately 60 descendants to discuss their shared heritage and the recently revealed information about what their fathers and grandfathers had endured. Several reported that the declassified information helped explain family patterns they had observed growing up. "Dad couldn't stand being around raw meat," explained Susan Carrington, daughter of Lieutenant Edward Carrington. "Mom had to prepare it when he wasn't home. He'd leave the house if she was making stew. We thought it was just a weird quirk until the files were declassified, and then suddenly all these family stories made terrible sense. His body knew what his mind didn't." The reunion culminated in a private ceremony where family members read aloud the names of the men who had been imprisoned at Stalag-9, an act of reclamation and remembrance that neither minimized their suffering nor defined them solely through victimhood. They created an online archive of personal histories, photographs, letters, and testimonials that provided human dimension to what might otherwise remain merely a grotesque historical footnote. In an especially poignant moment, Emily Weber, great-granddaughter of Klaus Hoffmann and daughter of novelist Elise Weber, met with the American families. Her prepared statement acknowledged her great-grandfather's complicity while emphasizing his eventual choices. "I cannot change what happened in that kitchen. I cannot erase the horror your loved ones experienced, even unknowingly. I can only say that when confronted with the ultimate moral test, my great-grandfather chose to stop the atrocity, to document the truth, and to bear witness. He believed the story needed to survive even if it destroyed him. That commitment to human dignity, even after it had been so thoroughly violated, represents the only redemption possible from such darkness. For those 342 American prisoners who unknowingly consumed their fellow humans, for the kitchen staff who knowingly prepared such meals, for the German civilians whose desperate hunger normalized the unthinkable, and for the bureaucratic systems that ultimately concealed then exposed these events, the question remains, what meaning can possibly be extracted from such horror? Perhaps only this, that human dignity proves simultaneously more fragile and more resilient than we prefer to believe. That circumstances can transform ordinary people into participants in atrocity without erasing their essential humanity, and that the path back from such transformation requires both unflinching acknowledgement and surprising mercy, sometimes from others, but ultimately from ourselves. The Stalag 9 incident stands as warning and testimony alike, a reminder that the distance between civilization and barbarism may be measured not in centuries of moral evolution, but in mere days of desperate hunger, that the capacity for both atrocity and redemption exists within the same individuals, that bearing witness to darkness, however painful, remains essential if future generations are to recognize warning signs before similar boundaries collapse. As Klaus Hoffmann wrote in his hidden journal, found decades after his death, "I once believed moral choices were absolute, clear divisions between right and wrong that any decent person would recognize instinctively. Berlin in 1945 destroyed such certainties forever. I watched good people make monstrous decisions when sufficiently desperate. I participated in horrors I cannot fully articulate even now. Yet I also witnessed unexpected courage, stubborn compassion, and the insistent human capacity to rebuild meaning from ruins. Perhaps that represents the only truth worth salvaging from our collective descent, that even at our worst, the possibility of return remains. Not to innocence, which war renders impossible, but to purpose, despite knowledge, we might prefer not to possess." The kitchen at Stalag 9 exists now only in fragile human memory, in classified documents and nightmares that troubled old men to their graves, and in the unexplained trauma passed through generations. Like all history's darkest chapters, its lessons remain imperfectly learned, its implications incompletely processed. Yet the very act of confronting such episodes, of refusing comfortable forgetting in favor of uncomfortable remembrance, may represent humanity's most essential defense against their recurrence.